friends, this is Advocate Tasmin Singh from NRI Legal Services. We regularly receive a lot of queries on tenant and landlord issues. These issues range from disputes arising between the lessor and lessee or questions regarding how to have contractual binding agreement with the tenant which would be completely protective in the scenario where a dispute arises. So, I'm going to cover the entire landscape which governs the relationship between a landlord and a tenant in two videos. In the first video, we would discuss all aspects of what a perfect rental agreement looks like, which should be completely sufficient in case there is a conflict between the two parties. In the second video, I would discuss in an in-depth manner the legal landscape which governs the relationship between a landlord and a tenant in different parts of India. So, what is a rental agreement? A rental agreement is a binding agreement between the landlord and the tenant which defines the terms and conditions of the tenancy comprehensively from the perspective of both parties. In the earlier days, the understanding between the two could have been oral, verbal, or even implied. But today, with the property prices surging and housing demands and supply both hitting the sky, it is advisable for both landlord and the tenant to secure themselves by executing a written rental agreement, which comprehensively defines all terms and conditions in an acceptable legal format to serve as evidence in any court of law in case a dispute arises. Most people draft and execute a rental agreement while letting out or renting a house, apartment, or commercial space for rent. The most important fact before executing a rental agreement is to remember its sole purpose, which is to enshrine the complete understanding between the two parties in such a way that could hold in any court of law if either side doesn't keep their part of the bargain. So, a background knowledge of the governing laws of the state is a must in which it needs to be applied. To achieve this, I cannot stress more that a rental agreement should always be drafted and executed with the guidance of professional legal expert rather than using boilerplate templates or with the sketchy knowledge of real estate brokers. The important points to be covered in a valid rental agreement are as follows. Number 1. Rent and deposit. Number 2. Payment of utilities like electricity and water charges. Number 3. Damages, repairs and alterations. Number 4. Tenants' responsibilities. Number 5. Owners' responsibilities. Number 6. Payment of maintenance charges. Number 7. Lease termination and extension. And lastly, miscellaneous clauses like visitation rights of the landlord, etc. So remember, an error-free, comprehensive and conclusive legal rental agreement should be executed and registered with the local authorities to document and to enforce all general specific clauses contained therein. To make it legally enforceable, keep in mind the following points. Number 1. Prepare the document in the specific format as per the convention and laws pertaining to that area. The stamp duty of the appropriate value needs to be paid and then the document needs to be printed on the stamp paper of the recommended value. A stamp duty paid rental agreement is considered a proper and legally valid document. It has evidentiary value as it is admitted as documentary evidence in courts. The rental agreement draft should be printed on a stamp paper of a suitable stamp value according to the Stamp Act of each state to make it legally valid. Next, ensure that both parties, the landowner and the tenant, sign at the bottom of each page and at the end. Signatures of the witnesses along with the name and addresses should also be included, with details of fixatures and schedule of the property as an attachment. Now, let's discuss types of rental agreement. Most commonly found agreements are of a period of 11 months only. The reason for this is that any agreement exceeding 11 months will have to be registered with the stamp duty paid. Agreement of 11 months and less are valid and can skip the formalities of the registration process, hence are very commonly found in India. Next, long-term lease. Another popular mode of renting is on a long-term lease for a certain number of years. There is no monthly rent payable by the tenant. At the end of the term of lease, the owner has to return the lease amount to the tenant. Electricity, water and maintenance charges have to be paid regularly by the tenant. There is no interest paid on the lease amount. Next, commercial rental lease. The procedure of registration and stamp duty are the same as residential properties for renting of the commercial properties also. The procedure for registering a commercial lease and the stamp duty associated with it are very similar to that of rental agreements. Even though registered commercial leases are for much longer periods and also some residential ones as well. There is no bar on the duration of the lease and should be mentioned in the agreement. General and specific clauses refer following issues and should be made part of the document on mutual consent of both parties. Number 1. Visitation rights of the landlord to inspect his property. Generally, after the property is tenanted, the right of the tenant are absolute and a landlord cannot just visit the property at his own free will unless he is in possession of a portion of the property, or else his rights are clearly elucidated in the rental agreement. For all else, he will have to seek the tenant's permission to visit once the tenancy commences. Number 2. For deposit by the tenant, there are no rental laws governing this. So it has to be decided as per the mutual understanding which should be a part of the agreement, that whether a tenant will pay 1 month rent as a deposit or 3 or even 10 months, covering the entire period of the lease. It is also negotiable. Number 3. Payment of maintenance charges by the tenant is also a variable clause and needs to be clearly reflected in the agreement as to who is responsible for paying the same for maintenance of common facilities of the property. Even though the tenant is liable to pay for it mostly, but in some cases the landlord is responsible to pay the maintenance charges to the society after duly collecting it from the tenant included within the rent. This needs to be clearly mentioned in the agreement as well. Next, notice period to terminate the lease can vary from 1 to 3 months, and this needs to be clearly mentioned with mutual understanding in the agreement. Same applies for an early termination if need be. Any other special privileges or rights extended to a tenant or a landlord clearly needs to be mentioned. If not contained in the agreement and done, it will be constituted as a violation and can be grounds for eviction or injunction against the landlord. Next, the lock-in period. The period before which neither the owner nor the tenant can terminate the agreement. Pets. Whether the tenant can have pets in the rental property also has to be mentioned. Overstay. If the tenant continues to stay in the rental property even after the agreement term has ended, the owner can charge on per day basis. Penalty for late payment. If the tenant fails to pay the rent on the scheduled date, a small penalty or fine can be charged by the owner. Painting, maintenance and repairs are to be included in the agreement, mentioning clearly the duties of the landlord or owner and that of the tenant. Now let's talk about broad procedure to make a rental agreement. Number 1. Draft the agreement with the help of professional guidance. Number 2. Take a print of the agreement on stamp paper of appropriate amount of the stamp duty to be levied. Number 3. Both parties should sign the agreement in the presence of two witnesses who would attest the document. Number 4. Register the agreement at the sub-registrar's office, paying the appropriate registration fee. Let's have deeper understanding of stamp duties and the registration process. More and more developed towns, especially in Maharashtra and other developed states, are digitizing rental agreements, and there is no need to even take any printouts, and stamp duties can be paid as a fee separately. Stamp duty. It is the duty paid to the government on any agreement or transaction taking place. Stamp duty is valued on the basis of the value of the transaction. It is paid to the government by purchasing a stamp paper of the due value. There are two kinds of stamp papers, the traditional stamp paper and the e-stamp paper. More and more states are now adopting e-stamping and doing away with the traditional stamp papers. For example, most major metropolitan towns have shifted entirely to the e-stamping system operated by Stockholding Corporation of India. If a person needs stamp paper, he can approach the e-stamping vendors and purchase it from them. You need to provide your name and the purpose in the application form. The conventional stamp papers are now less and less in use. Next, registration. Charges related to registration. As property is a state subject, the registration amount varies for each state. General approximate guidance is for lease deeds up to 5 years, which is between 1.5% to 2% plus a possible 100 rupees for the security deposit paid. Up to 10 years, it could range from 3 to 5% and more than 10 years to 5 to 6%. Consequences of not paying the stamp duty or registration charges. An inappropriate stamp duty paid can result in penalties in case of dispute by the court, levying a 10 times penalty to even make a rental agreement good in law. Registration of rental agreement where needed and not done can have fatal consequences, for the agreement losing its evidentiary value in the court of law as the binding contract between the two parties. So till there is no dispute, people do not realize the value of a rental agreement, which is duly stamped and paid and registered. Shortcuts thus should be avoided while executing such important contracts. Documents to be presented by the owner for registration are: Number 1. The original proof of ownership or title of the property. Number 2. Two passport size photos. Number 3. Aadhaar card or its receipt while applying for it is mandatory. Number 4. ID proof like driving license, voter's ID and passport, etc. Number 5. The rental agreement printed on the stamp paper. Number 6. DD, that is demand draft of rupees 1100 towards registration charges. Documents to be presented by the tenant for registration are: Number 1. Two passport size photos. Number 2. Aadhaar card or the receipt received while applying for it. If the person is an Indian, if the person is a foreigner, then the original passport is needed. Number 3. If the tenant is a company, then the person coming for the registration should bring a board resolution or an authorization letter from the company mentioning the person's right to register the lease, along with the company seal. Number 4. If one person represents another person for the registration, then the power of attorney deed should be brought. Do not confuse notarization with registration. Notarization of the rental agreement is optional, as notarization is not registration and can never replace it. Courts do not accept them as evidence in case of disputes. Even if the deed is notarized, you still need to register it. Notary seal simply states that you have attested it in front of a notary public. So, I earnestly hope that you are now better informed about rental agreements in India. However, we will still be happy to address all queries regarding rental agreements and any guidance or consultation if needed. Simply reach out to us at query@nrilegalservices.com and our team will promptly respond. Thanks and have a great day.